Today I'm sharing how I got into Harry Potter and why I love it. Welcome to Candlewick Library. I'm Cheryl. There has been so much divisiveness over Harry Potter, and especially with Christians not thinking that children should read it or anyone should read it. And I have a very different viewpoint about that. I've also heard people say that they don't think it's very well written, it's childish, and I completely disagree with that as well. Stay tuned and I will explain both of these things. First, how did I end up loving Harry Potter? I was not a child when Harry Potter came out. I was in my early 20s, so not the target audience for this book. And it might be surprising that I got into it so much. I was working in downtown Salt Lake City, Utah at a daycare that was also a preschool. And one day after work, I decided to go to a little grocery store to grab a couple of things I needed. And as I'm checking out, right there in that impulse buy section where there's gum and candy and things, there was this book, Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone. Recently, my mother-in-law at the time had asked me if I was into Harry Potter, and I had no idea what she was talking about. I'd never even heard of it at that point. And afterward, I thought, oh, maybe she meant Beatrix Potter, who I did love, but I didn't think about that till after the fact. So when I saw this Harry Potter book in the grocery store, it took me back to that moment realizing she really did mean Harry Potter. And so I picked it up and read the back. Then it was my turn to check out, and I just threw it onto the conveyor belt and got it. It was $6.99 based on the back. I'm guessing that's how much it was. I did not have very much money at that time. It was kind of a huge expenditure for me to impulse buy a book at that point. But I went home and I started reading it that night, and I had the hardest time putting it down. I didn't have the money at that point to get the second book. The first, second, and third books were out at the time. I probably read it at least 2 times before I got the next books. That Christmas, my ex-father-in-law gave me the second, third, and fourth book, as the fourth book had just come out. And so I spent the next few weeks just devouring those books. And I just felt like I was transported into my childhood. Not in a bad way, just the magic, the wonder that you have as a child. I felt like I hadn't had that in a book for a very long time. As a child, I read children's books, but I actually read above my age most of the time. As a teenager, I read really, really cheesy books for the most part. It was like the dumbed down books for teenagers. There was an author named Jack Wayland, and there were other ones like him, and the books are really poorly written, very heavy-handedly teaching you a moral. Those were the kind of books I was reading most of the time. I did have the Anne of Green Gables books on repeat, and a few other classics that I read along the way. I think the closest I came to reading something that really excited me was when I discovered Caroline Cooney at the library, and I breezed through a bunch of her books that were out at the time. I listened to a couple of episodes on the Literary Life podcast about Harry Potter, and on that they talked about how in the 1990s that children's literature was mostly realistic fiction and short books, very short sentences, very limited vocabulary. So when Harry Potter came out, it broke the mold for books at that time. Sometimes that's hard to realize because since Harry Potter came around, it really changed the face of children's literature. But at that point in my life, I was not reading any children's literature. I was reading, like I said, cheesy teenage books or adult books that were really well written, with the exception of a couple of children's books that I had read as a kid that I still liked. So it was so different from anything else that I had ever read, and it was very different from anything I'd read at that time. One thing you should know about me, I guess, is that a lot of the books that I love, I came to as an adult. So Anne of Green Gables I've had since I was a kid, but Chronicles of Narnia, I didn't read that until I was an adult either. That might help you to understand why Harry Potter stuck out so much. I ended up introducing my mom to the books. I would just try to get everybody to read them. Before all the books were out, my life changed a lot. I got a divorce. A couple years later, I married my current husband. I had my first child, all during the time that these books were coming out. And I still remember how fun it was to go to the bookstore for the midnight release of the books. I did that for a few of them. Once we lived in Wisconsin and I was a young married couple, my first little baby, I didn't go to those anymore, but I would get the book sent to me as soon as it came out. And I remember staying up as long as I could with Deathly Hallows. I remember with Order of the Phoenix that Umbridge made me feel emotions so strongly that I don't remember ever having felt like that in a book at that point in my life. I think it takes a really strong writer to make somebody feel those kind of feelings toward a character in a book, especially something that was technically written for children. I know that some people started reading Harry Potter, and then as it got to books 5 and 6, they felt like it got too dark for their kids. But really, it was meant to grow with the kids. age 11 starting, and then you mature with Harry and his friends. As it gets darker, kids are usually going to be prepared for that. I did read the books, all 7 of them, to my kids when they were not even 11 yet. And we read them through a few times as a family. And we haven't had any problems with feeling like it was too dark for them. But I know that some people probably would. So first I want to address the fact that a lot of people have said these books are childish. They're children's books. Why waste time reading children's books? It's weird that adults read these books. I don't know if it's just because they've only read the first book, or if because when they read it, they're reading at face value and it just doesn't appeal to them. I don't know. Obviously, not every book is going to appeal to everybody, and we all have different tastes. And I read books sometimes that I think are not as well written or are more childish, and somebody else might see something in it that I don't. However, once you start really learning about what J.K. Rowling did with these books, you realize that these are not basic books at all. She has an entire ring system on these books where book 1 and 7 match, 2 and 6 match, 3 and 5 match, and then 4 is the hinge point. If you go into it knowing that, you start seeing those things that she mirrored in those books. There's also that cycle in each book itself. There's also the quests that Harry has to go through in the first book that match up to the rest of the books. There are symbols throughout every single book that have to do with Christianity, with mythology, with classical literature. There's Latin. There are so many levels to this book. I just took a class about Harry Potter. After listening to Literary Life podcast for book 1, I took the class that Angelina Stanford, one of the women on it, that she did for books 2 and 3, and I was blown away by some of it that I hadn't picked up on. The more you dive into these books, you actually see how much she put into them. She's actually quite brilliant. Once she got the idea, she planned the entire series for 5 years before even writing the first part of book 1. And it shows. Once you know what you're looking for, you will see it everywhere. You'll see how she uses colors and she uses different themes throughout the whole series. And one thing will point you to another. There's a level of alchemy throughout the whole thing. And alchemy was something that was very important in medieval literature, but beyond that too. And I've been able to find quotes from C.S. Lewis, and Martin Luther wrote about this Christian version of alchemy. And that is where the magic and everything comes from in the books. It's not sorcery. So that is actually one of my first points about parents that are afraid of their children reading magic or don't want magic in their home. The worst things that the publisher did was change the title from the Philosopher's Stone to the Sorcerer's Stone. Because the Philosopher's Stone is something important in alchemy. And Nicholas Flamel, who is a mentioned character in the book, was a real person in history. The Philosopher's Stone was a real thing that was talked about. They dumbed it down for American readers. Apparently, the publisher didn't believe that any American children would read anything with philosophy in it. And so they changed it to Sorcerer's Stone. And J.K. Rowling has said that's one of her biggest regrets, is letting them do that. If a parent saw Philosopher's Stone on the cover, they would have had a very different feeling than Sorcerer's Stone, because they would feel immediately like Sorcerer's Stone, sorcery, bad magic. And so that is one of the probably worst things that could have happened. But now I want to get a little bit more into that. What about the magic in the book? A lot of people will say the Bible calls out witchcraft and magic, so we shouldn't be reading any books with magic in them as Christians. I disagree with that to an extent, but I'll get to that in a minute. First, I want to share where my sensitivities lie with magic, just so that there's no misunderstanding about my opinion of magic. I am very sensitive to the occult, so I'm going to share a couple of personal stories here. One was when I was in 3rd grade. I lived in San Diego, California. My dad was in the Navy, so we moved around a lot. And I clearly remember the day that we went to school and they had to send us home because a pentagram had been drawn on our playground in blood, and there was a dead animal sacrificed at each point of the star. And I have never forgotten that, because it was horrific and frightening. It was my first real experience with that being real in the world, that there were people that did those kind of things. Fast forward to junior high school, and I read a book called Jay's Journal. I thought it was a real book about a young man who got into magic and occultish stuff, and demons came and spoke to him, and then he ended up committing suicide. It took place here in Utah, and I have since found out that the author took somebody's story and completely changed it, and that most of it is not real. And that she did that with other books where she wrote them as a journal form and they were completely made up. But this book, because probably it took place in Utah and the kid in it was Mormon like I was at the time, and because it had that same element, that same kind of occultish witchcraft that I saw as a child, it freaked me out and I had nightmares about this book. A little bit after that, I went to one of my friends' houses and they were playing with the Ouija board. I just didn't believe it. I wasn't freaked out by it. I didn't think it was evil. I just didn't believe it actually worked. As they were playing with the Ouija board, I refused to play it. I just was like, I don't want to play it. I'll just watch. And I didn't tell anyone why I didn't want to play. I just thought it was stupid. Then the Ouija board told them that. As I sat there watching my friends play with this Ouija board, I cannot express the horrible feeling I had the whole time, but especially after it started talking about me. I have also picked up books in my life, especially in the last few years, where it had magic in it, and I got a horrible feeling as I was reading it. It felt real, and it felt evil. It felt like something that I shouldn't be reading. And if you watch any of my videos about Mormonism, there is one where I talk about the founder of the LDS Church, Joseph Smith. There was treasure digging with spirits that looked the way they did when they were murdered and trying to appease these spirits, and finding out that the upside down pentagram was on a couple of the temples. Those were things that bothered me so much and were part of my journey out of the LDS Church because they stuck out to me so much. So obviously I'm not someone who is just okay with occult practices and magic in those ways. The real things that are real evil. I have never felt that way with Harry Potter. There are times when you're reading it when it is a little darker and the bad guys are doing things, and yet I still never got an evil feeling while reading about that because it's so obvious that they are the bad guys. What I always told people was that Harry Potter was a book about sacrifice. That is the main theme, love and sacrifice. And to me, those are very Christian themes. And so they felt very Christian to me, but I have since delved into it deeper, and I have found out how many Christian themes J.K. Rowling weaved through these books. So I'm going to share some of the things that I have learned. This is not all of it, but I recently read this book for the second time, Looking for God in Harry Potter by John Granger, and he's kind of an expert in Harry Potter, and also a chapter in Hollywood Heroes from Frank Turk. Now, neither one of these guys are the person that I, would go to for all of my theology. So I'm not saying that just because they said it in these books means it's true. It does match up with what I have learned in the class that I took and with my own experience reading the books. So I'm going to read a few of the things that John Granger wrote in this book first. He is sharing the story of how he read Harry Potter, and he was one of those evangelical Christians that was completely against Harry Potter, and he would not read it to his children. He didn't want it in his home. He felt like it was bad, just like a lot of Christians have. He says, a woman who worked in a natural food store where I shopped told me about the books and recommended them with some enthusiasm. And he said that this woman could not be construed as a traditional Christian. He said it didn't look like somebody he would meet at a Baptist church picnic. But she told him all about these books that he had to read to his children. And they did not even have TV in their home. And so they were a very media-free home. So he assumed that she was probably into Wiccan and made another mental note to steer away from Harry Potter. But then his 11-year-old daughter was given a copy of the first book by her pediatrician. So he decided to read the book first so that he could explain to his daughter why she wasn't allowed to read it. And he said, you can guess the rest of the story, I suppose. I read through the night and, ashamed of my judging a book by its readers, bought the other 2 books then available early the next morning and apologized to my friend. I began reading the books to my younger children that night and encouraged, nigh on required, that the older kids read them. I tell my story here for a couple of reasons. First, I hope you will remember that red flag caution was my first response to Harry Potter as a parent and a reader. I am a great admirer of the Harry Potter books and still maintain that caution in book selection is not ignorance or closed-mindedness. Those who are responsible for the shaping of young minds and hearts should be properly careful about what books their charges read, in the same way that they should be discriminating about what they eat for snacks or what they watch on the television. Only the careless or fools equate such prudence with prejudice. So that I agree. And if you, even after learning about things that have to do with Harry Potter, you still don't feel like it's right for your family, then it's not right for your family. And I don't think there's anything wrong with being discerning about what you bring into your home. Then he goes on to talk about how he learned about J.K. Rowling, and he learned about her schooling and how they had very similar educations, except that hers was even further on than his. They had the same taste in English and world fiction. She is familiar and fluent with the languages, philosophy, and literature of the classical and medieval worlds. She's expressed in hundreds of interviews that she loves Charles Dickens and Jane Austen, whose Emma is her favorite title. She has said, too, that she is a great admirer of C.S. Lewis, to the point of being physically incapable of being in the same room with a Narnia novel and not sitting down to read it. Her Harry Potter novels, not surprisingly, are filled with allusions to those authors, as well as to William Shakespeare, Leo Tolstoy, Franz Kafka, George Orwell, J.R.R. Tolkien, and Dostoevsky. So he talks in here about the range and the depth of her stories. And that's one of the things, like I was mentioning, that I think there are some people that have written them off. They only read the first book maybe, and think it's more childish. Or they read all of them and think the writing is maybe on the childish side and don't understand the depth that is actually there. He said, I was able to understand what makes these books different and better than almost everything being written today. Consequently, I was embarrassed by my ignorance when I learned how popular the books were around the world when I finally read them. But Pottermania was not a surprising or confusing phenomenon. Of course, people everywhere love these books. These stories resonate with the great story for which we are all designed. So he is going to go on and say what I said. I believe these books have more of a Christian theme than most Christian books I read. And you might scoff at that, but I would ask you to keep an open mind about that. Christians of all people should be celebrating the Harry Potter novels and the attendant Pottermania. The Potter books are the most edifying works of fiction written in many years, as any classicist, medievalist, or lover of traditional English plays and novels might tell you. The problem was that these readers and experts weren't telling anybody this. I knew that Harry was horribly misunderstood. When I said at a C.S. Lewis Society meeting that these books were within the tradition of great English writing rather than occult trash, I was told this was a unique interpretation and was invited to expand my comments into a presentation to that group, which I did. And so he says that in this book, in Looking for God in Harry Potter, I state my case for what I see as a profoundly Christian meaning at the core of the series. The Harry Potter novels, the best-selling books in publishing history, touch our hearts because they contain themes, imagery, and engaging stories that echo the great story we are wired to receive and respond to. I hope you enjoy it however you choose to read it. If you are a conservative Christian like me and you have not read the books or read only one or part of one before giving up on it, I hope you are encouraged by this book to read or reread the novels. If you are a secret Harry Potter fan who has chosen to stay in the closet for fear of criticism from your faith community, I hope this book empowers you to share how Harry's story harmonizes with God's story. If you are a parent, you will soon be able to share with your children some key points of Christian teaching because you will find them embedded in the stories your children love. Because of all the sound and fury in the popular media and coming from many pulpits, it may seem incredible to you that Harry Potter is not contrary to Christian faith, but a series of books nurturing faith, especially when their Christian and literary antecedents are understood. I am convinced the fundamental reason for the astonishing popularity of the Harry Potter novels is their ability to meet a spiritual longing for some experience of the truths of life, love, and death taught by Christianity, but denied by secular culture. Human beings are designed for Christ whether they know it or not. Then he goes on to talk about how, yes, the Bible does say you're not supposed to dabble in witchcraft, and that would be the occultish type witchcraft, the summoning of spirits, the divination, and I'll get back to that in a second. But he says reading about occult practice is not forbidden. So to get back to divination, some people might say, well, it does have divination in the book. There's a whole divination class. The thing you learn as you read the books and become familiar with them is that divination is one of the forms of magic that are mocked in the book. The divination class is complete hogwash. She doesn't know what she's talking about. The two characters, kind of symbols of wisdom, are the ones that talk about how much rubbish that class is. So divination is actually in it, but you find out why later. And it's not used as something to be done. It's not used as a class that everybody should take and something that you should believe in. He also talks about what is the wrong kind of magic, which would be invocational sorcery. The difference between invocational and incantational magic isn't something we all learned in the womb, so let me explain. Invocational means literally to call in. Magic of this sort is usually referred to as sorcery. Scripture warns that calling in demonic principalities and powers for personal power and advantage is dangerously stupid. History books reveal tradition and fantasy fiction, think Dr. Faustus, that touch on sorcery do so in order to show us that the unbridled pursuit of power and advantage via black magic promises a tragic end. But there is no invocational sorcery in the Harry Potter books. Even the most evil wizards do their nasty magic with spells. Not one character in any of the 6 books ever calls in evil spirits, not once. That can also show that title change of the difference where sorcery should not be on the title. And also, the evil wizards are shown as wanting to use their magic for power. They do only do it with spells, but it is that they want power. There's even a line that there is no good and evil, there's just power. And of course that comes from the villain. Children are supposed to be learning that that is not the right thing. The magic by spells and wands in Harry Potter is known as incantational wizardry. Incantational means literally to sing along with or to harmonize, which if you are a Narnia fan, that may resonate with you. It is the same kind of magic. And he even brings up the scene in Prince Caspian when there are the 2 characters on the good side that decide that their only hope is magic. Prince Caspian decides on musical magic. He has a horn that Aslan, the Christ-like lion of these books, had given to Queen Susan to blow in time of need. I don't want to read too much of this because I don't want to spoil it, but there is another character that decides to use sorcery instead. He wants to summon the White Witch. And so Narnia also shows the difference between the 2 different kinds. So yes, Harry Potter has magic in it, but it is not demonic magic. Anything in it that is evil in the magic world is shown to be such. Like I said, I believe the overall theme is love and sacrifice, but it is also a battle of good versus evil. And your children should know the difference when they're reading it. He says, the magic in Harry Potter is consistent with and even fosters a worldview affirming spiritual realities because it is incantational rather than the forbidden invocational magic. It illustrates the right and wrong uses of power and talents. It is a world inside Muggledom paralleling the Christian worldview, and it reinforces the Christian view of the world as creation rather than a natural accident devoid of meaning. He says, an Orthodox Christian bishop has noted that Harry haters have missed the spiritual forest for the sake of their fixation on the magical imagery of the literary trees. And I think that's 100% true. I do find it kind of ironic how many people I know that are Christians talk about how horrible Harry Potter is and that we shouldn't be reading it, but then they love Lord of the Rings or they love Narnia. I don't know if it's just because they think those authors are more Christian than J.K. Rowling. I understand more if somebody doesn't allow it at all from any book or any movie or any other source than I do from people who allow it in some ways and not in others when it's the same kind of magic. But I think that that's the problem. I think a lot of people don't realize that she is more in the tradition of Lewis and Tolkien. And she even has said that. She said that she wrote in the tradition of the Inklings. And as far as C.S. Lewis, he explained in an essay called Sometimes Fairy Stories May Say Best What's to Be Said, his concern with sharing his faith in story form was that readers, especially young readers, don't like preachy stories or transparent allegories. The secret to reaching the hearts of readers longing for Christian experience of some kind is to recast the story in fantasy. In Of Other Worlds, he wrote this. But supposing that by casting all these things into an imaginary world, stripping them of their stained glass and Sunday school associations, one could make them for the first time appear in their real potency. Could one not thus still pass those watchful dragons? I thought I could. The Hogwarts motto is Draco Dormiens Numquam Titilandus. I don't know Latin, so I might have said that wrong, which translates roughly as never tickle a sleeping dragon. Toward the end of the book, he says, I close by repeating the response C.S. Lewis made to Christian critics who objected to the magic in his Narnia series. Do you think I am trying to weave a spell? Perhaps I am, but remember your fairy tales. Spells are used for breaking enchantments as well as inducing them. And you and I have need of the strongest spell that can be found to wake us from the evil enchantment of worldliness which has been laid upon us for nearly 100 years. In the chapter of Hollywood Heroes that is about Harry Potter, Frank Turek says something that a lot of people might not know. And that is that according to J.K. Rowling, the entire Harry Potter series is summed up by 2 Bible verses found on tombstones in the story. The last enemy that shall be destroyed is death. 1 Corinthians 15:26, and where your treasure is, there will your heart be also. Matthew 6:21. J.K. Rowling herself has said that she did not tell anyone that it was a Christian story during the interviews in the early books because she felt like that would tell people where the story was going. If they knew it was a Christian story, then they would know what was going to happen in each of the books and then overall. There was a reason that wasn't a known thing at first, but then that's also the author admitting that that she did have these Christian themes in it. She also doesn't personally believe in magic depicted in the story. It's just that in her fantasy Harry Potter world, magic provided powerless children with power they had nowhere else. Magic lifts the imagination, but magic isn't the center of the story. Human nature is. And that's one of the things I've tried to tell people throughout the years when they bring up these things with me. These stories might have magic in them, and it might feel like they're all about magic because it's at a school for magic. It's witches and wizards. They're doing magic spells, but it isn't about the magic. It is about the battle between good and evil. It is about Harry starting out as this young kid needing to be refined, who he turns out to be at the end. There are other things people have brought up, the kids breaking rules and things like that, and that comes from the tradition of boarding school stories in England, which a lot of us Americans aren't really familiar with. However, it's also one of those things where for quite a few years I had people telling me in the homeschool curriculum that we used to use what kind of stories children should be reading. And the stories that would be presented were almost always perfect children being perfect all the time. And that's where you're supposed to get the moral from. And while I as an adult can look at that and I can usually appreciate that, and you know, in a story like Little Women, you have a couple of characters that are that way and then a couple that aren't. And you can really appreciate the ones that are inherently just good, that are just good and just try to do the right thing all the time. And you love that because your children can see that and they can point to those characters and want to be more like them. But then they can also relate to the characters that are more like them in our fallen world where we tend to sin a lot. But I never as a child would have related to one of those perfect children. I had rebellious times. I had temper tantrums. I broke the rules. And I would think that most kids probably did. And I think it's more impactful when a child sees someone who has broken the rules and then sees what they become later than it is to see somebody who's just perfect all along, because that's not going to feel really reachable for them. And in fact, even in the first book, there is one character, he stands up against the main characters when they are about to break a rule. He ends up being rewarded more than they are. When people say, oh, well, they get rewarded for breaking the rules. Yes, they do sometimes. Sometimes good things happen from them breaking the rules. But the kid that was rewarded the most is the one that also stood up to his friends. And they make a point of saying that that is sometimes harder than standing up to your enemies. And then also, we all know that in this world that we live in, sometimes rules are not fair. And sometimes you have to make a choice of breaking a rule that isn't good, not always giving in to everything people are telling you to do. And so it is a parent's job to teach their child what the difference is. I don't have a problem with those either. I think that they give you really good conversation starters with your children. So that is, again, something that parents should be involved with. And they should be teaching their children the difference between fantasy and real occult stuff. I don't think that that is something that should make anyone shy away from Harry Potter. I have a couple of resources that I would want to point anyone to who is still on the fence about this. Maybe you think these are good points, and maybe you are interested in reading Harry Potter, but something is still holding you back. Again, not everybody has to read them, and not everybody has to love them. But if you feel that way, I would really encourage you to maybe pick up Looking for God in Harry Potter. But one of the main things I would recommend is the Literary Life podcast with Cindy Rollins and Angelina Stanford and Mr. Banks. They have an episode. It was originally episode 104, but then they did a best of, and so now it's episode 168. It's called Witches, Wizards, and Magic, Oh My, and it was posted back in April. I also would recommend their Harry Potter series. They did 4 episodes on the first book in July. They do a really good job of not spoiling further later books in it, so you could listen to it. If you haven't read the first book yet, you'd be spoiled on some things. But if you've read the first book, you could go and listen to it. And I do recommend her class on House of Humane Letters on Harry Potter. So hopefully that helps some of you who may be on the fence or want to have things that you can use when people bring this up. I believe Harry Potter, like I said, has more Christian themes in it than almost any other book that I have read in the last 20 years. You will start to see it as you read them if you know what you're looking for. There are things in it that symbolize Christ, and when you understand how she uses them, you know she's using them that way, like unicorns and phoenixes. So if you've read the books, you will understand what I mean by that. I don't want to spoil it on here for anybody, but I will talk about those things more in the videos I make in September and beyond as I reread the books. I've already read the first 2 books in my reread this year. So in September, videos on both of those will be coming out. And then as I read each one, I'm going to try to put one out. And I will have a non-spoiler and a spoiler section for those. So I will talk about some of the symbology that I've learned. So if you want to watch those as well, that will help you with some of that. But I believe that these are books that teach kids to be loyal, to choose what's good and right over what's easy. They teach them about self-sacrifice and dying to oneself. They teach about looking out for and protecting those that are weaker than you. And they always show the bad guys in that light. You know what magic is wrong, and you know why. And everything in it, even the bad magic, is more about human nature and the heart than it is about what they're doing. I really recommend it. I think that the more you learn about Harry Potter, you will understand why an adult 47-year-old woman could still be completely in love with these books so much that I would want to do a readathon, that I reread the book over and over again, that I take classes on it, that I get excited about it, because these books have so many layers. And the more you find that out, the more exciting it becomes to read them and to look for those little Easter eggs that are throughout all of the 7 books. So I hope you enjoyed this. I hope you learned something, or, at least understand maybe why other people feel differently about them than you do if you still have a negative opinion about them. I've said in another video that I will be having a lot of Harry Potter content on my channel in September because of the readathon, and obviously more this August leading up to it. But for those of you who are not interested in Harry Potter at all, if you've watched this anyway, there will be at least one video on my channel every week that is not Harry Potter related, but there will be a lot of Harry Potter content. So look forward to that if you enjoy this content. If you've got this far, I really appreciate you watching this whole thing, and I hope that it has given you new eyes to look at Harry Potter.